The sky hung heavy with thick gray clouds, casting a solemn shadow over the national cemetery. Rows upon rows of American flags lined the burial grounds, their fabric rippling softly in the chilly autumn breeze. The rhythmic flapping of the flags was the only sound accompanying the quiet shuffle of mourners taking their seats at the front of the gathering. A polished wooden casket rested on a platform draped with the American flag. Sergeant Daniel Reeves had come home for his final rest, a man who had served his country with unwavering dedication, both on the battlefield and in the K-9 unit beside the coffin lying on the grass. With ears drooped and eyes clouded with sorrow was Max Daniel's loyal German shepherd. Max had been more than just a dog. He had been Daniel's partner, his protector, his unwavering shadow through years of service. And now, as Daniel's family sat with tear-streaked faces, Max remained where he had been since the casket arrived, silent, unmoving, his deep brown eyes fixed on the man he had spent a lifetime following. The ceremony was conducted with quiet reverence. A priest stood near the casket, reading scriptures about honor and sacrifice. Veterans in crisp uniforms sat among the mourners, their hands resting over their hearts. The air was thick with grief, but there was also a profound sense of respect, of gratitude. Then came the moment, the 21-gun salute. The first crack of the rifles shattered the silence. Max's ears twitched, his body flinching slightly. The second volley rang out, and Max let out a soft whimper. By the third shot, he was trembling. Emily Reeves' Danielic daughter noticed Max's unease and reached out to him. "It's okay, buddy," she whispered, her voice shaking. I know you miss him," but Max didn't move toward her then as the final shots echoed through the cemetery, and the folded American flag was solemnly handed to Emily. Max let out a sharp, heart-wrenching bark, and then before anyone could react, he leapt onto the casket. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few veterans instinctively stood unsure if they should intervene. The priest faltered mid-sentence, his gaze fixed on the psyche before him. Max lay down atop the casket, pressing his body against the wood as if trying to feel Daniel's presence through it. A low, sorrowful howl escaped his throat, a sound so raw, so full of heartbreak, that it sent shivers through everyone in attendance. Emily clutched the folded flag to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Max, one of Daniel's fellow soldiers, stepped forward, reaching toward the dog. "Come on, boy, it's time." But Max wouldn't budge. His body was stiff, his golden brown eyes locked onto the casket, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. And then something changed. Max's ears perked sharply, his muscles tensed, his nose twitched wildly as if he had just caught a familiar scent. Then with sudden urgency, he began to nudge the casket with his nose, whining softly at first. Then more insistently, the Mers exchanged uneasy glances. "What's he doing?" someone murmured. Emily stepped forward, concern flickering in her tear-filled eyes. Max the dog whined again, his front paws scratching at the edge of the casket. It wasn't frantic, wasn't panicked. It was purposeful. Almost knowing, a hush fell over the gathering. The wind had died down, and for a moment the air felt unnaturally still. Then something incredible happened. A murmur swept through the crowd like a ripple in still water. Mourners exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves as Max continued to nudge at the casket, his paws scraping against the polished wood. Emily's breath hitched. "Max, come here, buddy." Her voice was barely above a whisper, thick with grief, but the dog didn't move. He remained frozen, his eyes locked on the casket, ears, alert, body trembling. A veteran in uniform, Corporal Sam Peterson, stepped forward. His expression, grim yet intrigued. He had served with Daniel and had seen firsthand the deep connection between soldier and K9. He studied Max closely, then turned to Emily. "These dogs, they have a sixth sense," he murmured. "They can feel things we can't." Maybe he hesitated, though maybe Max knows something we don't. Silence fell over the gathering. Then suddenly Max whined and began digging at the casket. The sound of his claws against the wood sent a shiver through everyone. His movements weren't frantic, weren't mindless. It was deliberate, as if he was trying to reach something. A nervous hush settled over the Murs. Some shifted uneasily in their seats. The priest, momentarily stunned, clutched his Bible tighter. The air around them felt different. It was subtle at first, a strange, almost unnoticeable warmth that seemed to radiate through the cold cemetery air. The wind, which had been rustling the flags just moments ago, had stilled completely. Emily felt it. A tingling sensation pricked her skin, like standing in the presence of something unseen yet powerful. She wrapped her arms around herself, her heart pounding. Then, as the priest cleared his throat to continue the final prayer, the American flag draped over the coffin shifted. A collective gasp erupted from the crowd. The fabric moved just slightly, a gentle, deliberate ripple across the surface despite the eerie stillness of the air. Max threw his head back and howled. Not a mournful howl this time. Something different, something hopeful. Emily's chest tightened, her fingers clutching the folded flag in her lap. She could feel her pulse hammering against her ribs, and then her phone buzzed. The sound was deafening in the heavy silence. She nearly dropped the device as she fumbled to pull it from her coat pocket. Her stomach lurched as she saw the screen incoming voicemail. "Dad," her finger F trembled as she pressed play. A click. A moment of static, then her father's voice. "Hey, sweetheart, if you're hearing this, I guess it means my time's up." Emily gasped. A sob, catching in her throat, a hush fell over the crowd. "I just wanted you to know. I love you, and I'll always be with you. And Max, take care of him. If he ever acts strange around my grave, don't be scared." Emily clapped a hand over her mouth. "That just means I'm still here." The message ended. Max lowered his head and licked Emily's hand softly, as if he too understood the cemetery was silent. No one spoke. No one moved. But in that moment, Emily knew Daniel Reeves had never really left. Emily stared at her phone, her hands shaking the weight of the message. Her father's voice, recorded before his passing, pressed down on her like a wave she couldn't escape. "That just means I'm still here." Tears spilled freely down her face. The mourners around her, once stiff with grief, were now silent, listening, watching, absorbing the impossible moment unfolding before them. Max sat beside her, his ears twitching as if he too had heard Daniel's words. He didn't whimper anymore, didn't scratch at the casket. Instead, he lowered his head, pressing his forehead softly against the wood, his breathing slow and steady. It was as if he understood. Emily let out a shaky exhale, brushing her fingers over the folded flag in her lap. He knew this was going to happen. Her father had prepared her in his own way, and Max he had known too. A warmth settled in her chest, breaking through the cold grief that had gripped her all morning. She looked around, seeing the same quiet realization in the faces of those gathered veterans, nodded solemnly, understanding the kind of bond that didn't break, not even in death. Even the priest, his voice thick with emotion, murmured, "Some bonds never break." Max finally lifted his head from the casket and turned his golden brown eyes, meeting Emily. Then slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, closing the space between them. He nudged his nose against her palm, his body leaning into her touch. Emily let out a quiet sob and wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. "You're staying with me," she whispered, pressing her forehead to his. "I promise." As the ceremony neared its end, the honor guard prepared for the final farewell. A soft wind stirred through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the great oak trees that lined the burial grounds. Then a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible whistle carried through the air. Emily stiffened. It was distant, barely there, but unmistakable. The same short, sharp whistle her father had always used to call Max during their service days. Her breath hitched. Her fingers tightened in Max's fur. Max's ears perked up, his head tilted slightly, his tail giving a single slow wag. Emily let out a tearful laugh, looking up at the sky. The ache in her chest still lingered. But for the first time, it wasn't just pain. It was love. It was memory. It was proof. Her father was still here, and through. Max's loyal companion, his final gift to her. He always would be the days following. The funeral were quiet, too. Quiet. Emily moved through them like a ghost caught between the weight of grief and the strange lingering warmth her father's final message had left behind. Some nights she still expected to hear his voice. Some mornings she found herself reaching for her phone, thinking for a split second that she could still call him. But the person who felt it the most, who truly seemed lost, was Max. For days after the funeral, he barely moved from the spot beside her father's chair. He would sit there, head resting on the cushion as if waiting for Daniel to come home. He refused to eat much. He hardly responded when Emily called his name. The once alert and energetic German shepherd was now a shadow of himself, just like she was. But then something changed one morning. Emily stepped onto the porch with her coffee, expecting to see Max in his usual spot by the chair. But this time he wasn't there. Instead, she found him standing at the edge of the yard, ears perked, nose lifted toward the crisp morning air. His posture had changed. He didn't look lost anymore. He looked ready. Emily furrowed her brows. "What is it, boy?" Max turned to her golden brown eyes, shining with something she hadn't seen in weeks. Purpose. And in that moment she understood Daniel wouldn't have wanted them to stay stuck in grief. He had spent his life serving others, training dogs like Max to be protectors, companions, lifesavers, and maybe that was what she was meant to do too. For the first time in weeks, Emily felt something other than pain. She felt determined. That very night she sat at her father's old desk, scrolling through pages of information on K-9 training programs. She read about veterans who had gone on to work with military dogs, training them for search and rescue therapy and law enforcement. And the more she read, the more certain she became. Her father had left her something more than just memories. He had left her a calling, and she was going to follow it. A few weeks later, Emily and Max sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the treetops. It was one of those rare, perfect evenings, the kind where the air was just cool enough, where the world felt still but alive. Max sat beside her, his head resting against her knee, his tail sweeping the wooden porch and slow, steady movements. Emily let out a soft sigh. "We going to be okay, buddy?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "We've got work to do," Max let out a small, contented huff. Then a tiny glow flickered in the air. Emily stilled. A single firefly hovered in front of them, its light pulsing softly in the dark. It floated near Max for a moment, before drifting toward Emily, hovering at eye level, as if watching her. She held her breath, her heart pounding, and just as suddenly as it had appeared, the firefly blinked out of sight, disappearing into the night. Max's ears perked up, his tail wagged once, and then he barked a happy, familiar bark. Emily felt the tears come, but this time they weren't heavy with sadness. She smiled, tilting her head toward the sky. "I know, Dad," she whispered. "You're still here." Max nudged her hand, and together they stood. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Emily wasn't afraid. She had Max by her side. She had her father's memory guiding her, and she had a future worth stepping into. As the night settled around them, Emily and Max walked down the driveway toward purpose, toward healing, and toward the unbreakable bond that would never fade. Some bonds are so strong that not even death can break them. Emily lost her father, but through Max, his love and legacy lived on. Their story is a powerful reminder that love never truly leaves us. It simply finds new ways to stay. If this story touched your heart, imagine all the incredible tales waiting for you here on Amazing Paws. Stories from heartwarming rescues to incredible acts of loyalty. We bring you the most unforgettable stories of animals and the humans who love them. Subscribe now and be part of our growing community of animal lovers. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story, because sometimes the ones we love never really say goodbye.